The actual stand in the schoolhouse door, as dramatic and crucial as it was, is what we saw on the surface. But there was so much more going on over time that resulted in the eventual integration of the university, bringing us now a rare, behind-the-scenes look at what transpired leading up to the desegregation of the University of Alabama is Mr. Stan Murphy, University of Alabama counsel retired. He was the representing attorney in the Alabama Higher Education desegregation lawsuit. Mr. Stan Murphy.
After Art, Earnestine, if I had any sense at all, I wouldn't say anything. So I will demonstrate that I don't have much sense. That was accomplished by lawyers and bayonets. That was desegregation. Immigration, far more difficult, complex, permanent, lengthy process. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But I've got a bad throat, I'm sorry. I was very fortunate in my life, in the accident of my birth, to grow up in a house with two parents who were at the center, at the eye of this civil rights hurricane in the 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s. I want to make it clear a couple of things is I'm not speaking as somebody with personal accomplishments during that year. I'm talking about somebody who was an observer of great bravery on the part of my parents and many of their friends and colleagues. Some of whom are here tonight. Many of them are members of this community. My dad was a law professor, my mother was a lawyer and a political science instructor. Both were very active in the civil rights movement. What is not often recognized is that before this day in 1963, there were decades of activity and work and commitment and personal sacrifice, and fear, and anger, and harsh voices, and calm threats. My own advice, I think, Earnestine, I don't know, you have to correct me, I think for white people, my family holds the record for crosses in the yard. It got so bad at one point that my dad put a galvanized bucket of sand in the yard and said, please put the cross here, you're tearing up the sod. In 1954, the United States Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus Board of Education to hold that you cannot have racially segregated public elementary and high schools. The state of Alabama had a fork in the road to take, and it took the fork that it has taken too many times in its history, and that is to set about to prove that, well, that's well and good, but you don't understand the Constitution of the United States does not apply here. We have our own Constitution. Alabama politicians have made a living from proving to themselves and those constituents who are gullible enough to believe them that we're not part of the United States. So the response of our state, the Blue Ribbon Legislative Committee, was to say, well, that's good. We understand that public schools have to be integrated if you believe what that bunch says. What we'll do is we'll just do away with public education. We will privatize the public schools. We'll still collect some taxes for public education, and then we'll give all the parents, black and white, equally vouchers that they can go spend to buy their education on the market. They can go wherever they want. Well, guess what? The law at the time did not apply to private schools, so they were going to have the fine choice of going to buildings that they had built and paid for and playgrounds that they had built and paid for, but now were private, and they could use their school voucher to go to an essentially private institution. So when you hear the talk about vouchers today, you've got to understand that's an echo from 1954. Well, my dad was a young law professor at the University of Alabama. It was 1954. He immediately wrote an article in the Alabama Law Review called "Can Public Schools Be Private?" where he discussed this effort on the part of the legislature of Alabama. So here's what they're planning to do. Here's why, very overt, they made no secret about it. This is so we can avoid the mandate of Brown versus Board of Education. And in my judgment as a law professor, that has not got a chance of working. Any federal judge in the United States will see through that instantly and will throw out the whole program. The program never did come into being, but the next time the Alabama legislature met, there was an amendment to the University of Alabama budget to pay it all except for Jay Murphy's salary. I learned the value of tenure at an early age. So when I hear debates about post-tenure review and tenure, I say, I remember, we ate pretty well, and we could buy fire extinguishers. I learned the value of a law degree, because during this same time, my mother, Ernestine's story of the bus reminded me a little bit, one of the cases that she had as a private lawyer, bear in mind, she could be in court as a lawyer, she couldn't be on a jury in Alabama, because both black people and women were not permitted to be on juries, because, of the irrational vapors that get a hold of them sometimes. So, my mother could practice law, she just couldn't be on the jury. So, none of this is funny, but I can't help it. It is funny. It is, and that's the proper way to look at it. I wouldn't give anything for these experiences. She represented 3 young black teenage boys whose crime was staring at white university sorority sisters. Now, not direct staring, but indirect staring through the rearview mirror of their car. She won that case. But that's the context of what was going on. In 1956, Arthur and Lucy enrolled here at the university. It lasted a matter of days or weeks. It was a cause of great discord on this campus. Some even had called it mobs, of violence, of threats. And the Board of Trustees of the University of Alabama expelled her. They expelled her because she was black, but because of the perceived hazards to the university. They expelled her. That was such a shock to this university community. And bear in mind, this is a complex institution with complicated people. There were members of the University of Alabama community who actively opposed that desegregation, students in particular. It was such a shock, I think, to many of the core people here that there began a concerted, organized effort to make sure that never happens again. There was a Council of Human Relations formed. My parents were at one time or another the head of it. It was black people from the community and white people from the community, and frankly a lot of university people. University people dominated this discussion. Because it was true, it was a hotbed of bleeding heart liberal left-wingers, right? And back then, as Art said earlier, all that meant was race. That didn't have a darn thing to do with your view of the capital gains tax or tax structures or anything else that we confuse liberal to now. It was all race. And so you were defined as a liberal or a conservative by what your view on that was. They formed a group, this Council on Human Relations, and they called for the immediate peaceful integration of the University of Alabama. A very fine publisher of the Tuscaloosa News wrote a series of editorials commending that group, among other things, and won a Pulitzer Prize for it. But the Buford Boone, who was that editor, some of you remember him, the council, this council that my folks were on, is the first and only group to face up publicly to the possibility that difficulties may develop again at Alabama in the fall, and urged the handling of whatever problems without resort to violence and outside of the law activity. Just speaking up for peaceful integration, obedience to the law was a dangerous act. Now, what that has done, what this aura has done, what makes 63 important to me is this creates great tension between the University of Alabama and the political leadership of the state. This was frowned upon activity. This was, university budgets were held up. Threats were made. And so it took a lot of courage from the administrators and the faculty and ultimately the student body here to persist in that endeavor. But you can't just view this as a single day effort, right, Ernestine? With Nicholas Katzenbach standing there next to Vivian Malone, walks up here, he's engaging in what is essentially a choreographed, pre-planned event. Everybody actually had marks on the pavement of where to stand. There was no doubt how that was. It was a fraud and a sham. When she walked through that door, and James Hood walked through that door, they met an auditorium full of University of Alabama community members who were by and large very eager to have them. The university and all the other public schools in the state were sued in the early 1980s by the United States government and by affiliates of historically black institutions to inquire into whether or not there were continuing vestiges of that earlier segregated era. So I had the honor, my colleagues and I, Hattie's here, the Office of Counsel, had the honor of representing the university in essentially, 20 years of that, a couple of decades of that. And it was a great undertaking for a lawyer. On the one hand, we're representing the school that has the door which is emblematic of the problem which is at issue in the case. This is the door that got stood in. It was ours. We always believed that that imposed a special obligation and burden on us as lawyers and on our community. And every court that heard that case was very praiseworthy of this institution for the work that it's done. And Dot is going to talk in more detail about those results. I will say that it would aggravate our opponents, needlessly probably, but repeatedly, when we would point out that we, as lawyers for the University of Alabama, represent more black students than all the rest of the schools in the room combined. Black Alabama kids had, by that time, in the 80s and 90s, started coming to the University of Alabama. Much of this work is incomplete because we're human beings. This is a human institution. People say, I retired from the legal office 10 years ago, but is this an issue or a problem that's ever solved? Of course not. We're complex people and we're a complex institution. So the process of integration, desegregation is over and done. The process of integration is a continuing challenge that requires vigilant attention. And it's a very creative process and a very beneficial one for the institution. I think it's important to point out that the university community is not just faculty and students and administrators, but it's graduates from this place. And our graduates, I'm thinking of Carl Elliott, Mary Jolly here, who essentially the two of them, Congressman from Jasper, and Mary, as his assistant, were responsible for federal financial aid, which resulted in millions of American poor kids being able to go to school. And we're talking about diversity. We're not just talking about race, we're talking about economic diversity and the exclusions that operate as a result of economic differentials. Chuck Morgan, a young, upcoming lawyer in Birmingham, the day the church was bombed, that week he gave a speech to the Young Men's Business Club, and it was the best speech that's ever been given, I think, in this state, in which he said, I had a speech to talk about business opportunities, but I have solved this mystery of who bombed that church. I know. There's a silence, and he laid into it. He said, I tell you who did it. We did it. Every one of us, white, wealthy, up-and-coming leaders who have acquiesced to a lawless police department. Every white preacher who hasn't every Sunday talked with the Beatitudes and how the Sermon on the Mount applies to black people too. Every one of us who has chuckled or giggled at a racial joke. We are as guilty as that demented fool who lit the fuse. And he said, man, they promptly ran him out of town under threats of death for him and his boy and his wife, but he became the leading civil rights lawyer, I think it's fair to say, of the whole South during that era. And first of all, brought the suit that let my mother finally serve on a jury in this state throughout that law, desegregated elementary and secondary schools, continued the desegregation of higher education, ensured the equal application of the Voting Rights Act. Those are our graduates. So every time you go into Chuck's restaurant downtown, that's Chuck. That's named after the guy that gave that speech. So I talked way too long, but you can tell I sort of get carried away with it. There's a book which if you don't have, you need to get, by a young guy who was on the faculty here. He's now been hired away to Wisconsin, called Opening the Doors. They have copies. This is a story of what was going on other than the stand in the schoolhouse door by B.J. Hollers. And it really gives you some insights into local leaders like P.Y. Rogers and Reverend Linton and Joe Malisham and others who were very dear friends of ours. So I'll shut up now and thank you for this opportunity.